Welcome to Overwhelmed to Overcomer podcast with coach, encourager, and strategist Anna McLaughlin. If you're a Christian woman who has big dreams rooted in an even bigger God, but most days those dreams feel completely out of reach, trust me, I get it. As a homeschooling mama of 4, entrepreneur, investor, and all around wearer of many hats, I am right there with you. And yet the Lord invites us to live out our God-given purpose now in the midst of the madness. So let's explore together how we can know our calling and walk in it today with clarity, with courage, with each other. It's time for you to live the life you love and love the life you live. Let's do this thing. Hello and welcome to this next episode of Overwhelmed to Overcomer. I have a treat for you. Someone I know in real life, respect so highly. I know it's weird I say that. Respect so highly, admire so much. He's a published author, a thinker of great, deep thoughts. Josh Pauling, welcome to this podcast.
Oh, that's a very kind introduction. Hopefully I won't disappoint.
You will not.
Thanks for
You,
having me. Looking forward to talking with you.
I know, I'm so glad to have you. Okay, so not only are our girls really good friends, not only are we in the same homeschool community, but you also wrote an incredible book. Please tell us a little bit about you, Josh. We want to know.
Yeah, sure. So I do a lot of things, wear a lot of different hats, as many of your listeners do as well. So first off, I'm a husband and father. I have a wonderful wife, Christy, and 2 daughters that are 14 and 12. And as you said, we're homeschooling in the same co-op that your kids are in. And we've been in that for really their whole schooling career. And so life in a homeschool family has all sorts of challenges that it brings with it, that I definitely can relate to for sure. I also, as you said, wrote a recent book called "Are We All Cyborgs Now? Reclaiming Our Humanity from the Machine," with a co-author, Robin Phillips, and looking forward to discussing that with you today. I do some other writing for some magazines like Salvo and Touchstone, and a variety of magazines that really deal with issues related to education, culture, sort of the intersections of Christianity and culture, and how we should think about a lot of the issues that we're all facing. I also was a teacher and coach in public schools for 13 years. I taught American history mostly and coached cross country alongside my wife, Christy. Coached baseball for a little while as well. I resigned in 2021 for a variety of reasons. And at that point, became a tutor with Classical Conversations as well. So I tutor the Challenge 4 level in Rock Hill, South Carolina, for your listeners. And so that's the senior level in Classical Conversations. Basically, I'm their tutor for all of their subjects, history, literature, theology, and so forth. And we have lots of great discussions one day a week about all those subjects, which is really, really fun. I also run a business. I make custom furniture. I have a wood shop at the house that I run my business out of. And then I'm also a year into a vicarage at All Saints Lutheran Church. And this is what you would call probably sort of a pastoral internship. The term we use in our denomination is a vicarage. And so I am going through both sort of practical training and seminary training for that. So yeah, those are all the hats I wear, and grateful for the opportunity to do all those different things. So
Yes. So I lost track of all the hats, but I can relate when I think about my own list of things that I do, and I love the breadth. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how some of these things intersect that might not necessarily at first blush seem like they intersect, which really brings us to the heart of why we're having this conversation. So talk to me about this book, about the just where did this conversation arise, this idea of how do we engage with technology in a healthy way, and what does that have to do with our faith?
yeah, for sure. Great question. So really, the book project is, I would say, a multi-decade project in many ways, as a lot of books are. They're really life projects for their authors. And as you said, the variety of experiences I've had really create a unique set of not only experiences but ways of thinking about things. And so, as a teacher, I was encountering technology in the classroom and seeing the impact of phones on especially high schoolers. That was certainly one major area of interest and concern of mine, seeing the impacts on teenagers of digital technologies. And then also as a woodworker, using my hands, making furniture, that really grounded my way of thinking about what it means to be a person, what it means to be a human being. We have bodies that are meant to be used and are meant to encounter the limits of reality. And woodworking is a great way to experience that directly, right? You can only do so many things with wood, right? It has limits, it has boundaries. You have to go with the grain, right? Which is a great analogy for thinking about all sorts of things in life, for sure. So that experience of being a woodworker also plays a role in this, and then also being sort of a theologian and philosopher. My background really is in theology and philosophy, and my education and history as well. And so those three things really give a sort of a deeper perspective on how to think about our current contemporary situation. So many times we're just caught up in the moment, right? We don't sort of have a historical perspective, or maybe we don't think about things philosophically or theologically. But putting all those things together in relation to technology is very important. We can think about it historically. How have technologies impacted societies in the past? When, for example, the Industrial Revolution happened, what did all those technologies do to the family, to work, right, to transportation, all of those types of things? With the communication revolution, like the telephone, how did that impact society? How did the car impact society and causing people to move away from their families? I mean, there's all of these historical examples that you could think of as well. So some of that is, where this is coming from. And then, like I said as well, theologically, thinking of this from a Christian perspective, what does the Bible say about what it means to be a human being, right? To be made in the image of God. And most importantly, what does the incarnation of Christ have to do with technology? In other words, what are the implications of the fact that God took on a body, right? That he himself is embodied in Christ with flesh and bones, right? And that he still has his body. There's just so much profound material there to sort of connect the dots with our very digital moment and all of these other threads, right? So that's what we're trying to do in the book. We're trying to tie together really a lot of threads when it comes to how we should think about technology. So there's parts of the book that deal with technology in the home, technology in the church, even technology in politics, technology in society. We're really trying to put a lot of things together in the book so it can be a resource for folks, right? Whether you're a homeschooling mom, whether you're a pastor, a youth pastor, or somebody in your church, whether you're a boss of employees that are, using all sorts of digital technologies in their job, right? How should we think about all these things in a way that leads to human flourishing? I think that's a very important question we have to think about for sure.
Mm. I love what you said, human flourishing. And we're gonna get to, and I can't wait to this conversation about how can we cultivate human flourishing in the home, because that's where a lot of my listeners are, investing most of their time. But
Sure.
what I found so powerful, I think there's this deep frustration for a lot of moms, especially feeling like there's this tide I can't stop, that I'm kind of
Mhm.
powerless to stop. And what I love about what you did in the book is technology for me has felt like a recent fight, but you actually grounded it in looking at the development of text in the scriptures, and
Mhm.
how it used to be there were no spaces between words, and then there are spaces, and it used to be that the book was this precious, tangible, holy, incredibly expensive volume, maybe the size of
Right.
half a table. And
Sure.
now we pull the scriptures up on our phones. And to me, that feels like a very grounding place to start, is just understanding this technological advancement isn't new. It's just we're at a new level now. So can you take us through the the technological advancements we've seen in the scriptures and kind of the impact that we can experience, and specifically digging into what you talked about? I love how you talked about how the text can become utilitarian as opposed to like
Yeah.
a becoming. Can you talk through that for people?
Sure. Yeah, this is something that whole books have been written on. We have one chapter dealing with this issue of the development of the biblical text specifically. And the title, you got to have catchy titles, right? So the
You
title
do.
is called from scrolls to screens, right?
Yes.
And so basically the book, and Robin did a lot of the research for this chapter specifically. My co-author, Robin Phillips, I should make sure to give a shout out to him. He's a good friend. And the way we sort of teamed up for this project, if I could just make sure to mention that, is we were writing about a lot of the same themes in magazines and different online publications. And so we sort of started dialoguing about these issues, and he really had a vision for the book. So I want to give credit where credit is due. He's the one who suggested we team up and work together on this project, and he was great to work with. We had a lot of great conversations. Obviously, working together on a book is something. It's almost like when you try to mix family and business or something like that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But in our case, it was a great partnership. Um, but yeah, when we talk about the development of the scriptures, there's really a very complex and variegated history here. So the earliest scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, those were written during the ancient Near Eastern culture, if you will. And writing during that time was really just emerging. And there were no vowels and there were no spaces between letters. And so to write something down, it was meant to be vocalized. It was meant to be spoken. And so spaces and vowels weren't really necessary because you were familiar with the language as it was spoken. And it was just a way to vocalize by what you saw basically on some form of parchment, or in some cases, even what were called cuneiform tablets, basically clay tablets, right? So that type of writing of the scriptures then develops into what we call scrolls, right? In Hebrew, this would have been primarily this would have been during the Old Testament. And those scrolls still aren't very user-friendly in the way we think of a book today, right? You have to turn the dials, if you will, to get from one spot to the next. It's very large, very expensive, very tedious to work with. It doesn't really facilitate continuous reading in the way that what we would call a book would. And then eventually, though, those scrolls were developed into what we'd call codexes. And this really happens around the time of Christ, is when the codex comes more into prominence. A codex is basically papyrus that are stacked up together and then woven together into a binding. Okay, so it's really an early book, is a codex. So this is a codex, basically, if we want to get technical as far as the development of texts. And that development of the codex is really vital when it comes to continuous reading, when it comes to the ability to mark pages, when it comes to the ability to bookmark, right? All the things that we just assume with a written text really are things that emerge with the development of the codex. And a lot of the New Testament would have been put into codices. Okay, if we think about Paul's letters and so forth, those were really put into the codex form. And then from the codex, we're going to sort of fast forward to the Middle Ages, where we see a lot of illuminated manuscripts. These beautiful, as you said, these beautiful, expensive works that scribes would just slave over for long periods of time. And so this was really a work of art in addition to being a readable text. And that way of reading or experiencing a text, if you will, fosters a different sensibility around reading than we would have today, right? If you're holding in your hand something that was tediously worked over and artistically rendered over the course of many hours and hours, weeks, months, even years, maybe. Your experience of reading that, your value that you're going to place in that is going to be very different than this mass-produced book that is printed on demand when somebody orders it from Amazon, right? And so that would then lead to the development of the printing press. After the Middle Ages in about the 1500s, we really see the adoption of the printing press. Gutenberg in the late 1400s really is where this comes from. And the first, I would say, major event in world history that was impacted by the printing press was the Reformation, where the widespread dissemination of printed texts leads to a lot of the massive changes in society and in Christianity even. because of this ability to mass produce texts. Luther was a master of the printing press. Basically, when he was in Wittenberg, he'd be writing upstairs at his desk, and it'd be going to the basement to be printed right away, right?
Oh,
And this,
wow. I had
yeah,
no
yeah.
idea.
Oh yeah, there's a great book on this. It was published a few years ago. It's called Brand Luther, where it looks at Martin Luther and his use of the media technologies of the time, specifically the printing press. So yeah, they were publishing little pamphlets all the time. They were publishing woodcuts and artwork, and obviously longer treatises and so forth. So that printing press drastically changes the way we experience texts. It changes literacy levels, right? There's many benefits of the printing press, to be sure. But we'd also be foolish not to realize that it also brings a series of trade-offs, right? The ability to mass produce texts because of the printing press, and then later because of industrial printing presses through the Industrial Revolution. We can obviously get the information out to more people, but also that means you can get information you might not want to get out to people more efficiently, right? So you have propaganda, you have misinformation, and you also have what I would say is sort of a downside of the Reformation, and that is the ability for every individual, and I know I might step on some toes here with fellow Protestants, but the ability of each individual to come up with their own interpretation of Scripture, right? We as Protestants, we love the ability to read the Scriptures ourselves, right? As all Christians do, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, all branches of Christianity value the Scriptures. But Protestants, place a very high value on sola scriptura, Scripture alone, right? That's the only authority. But that means something a little different when every individual sort of takes their Bible in their own house and reads it by themselves, and maybe comes up with an interpretation that is novel or new. So I don't want to go down that rabbit trail again. I'm a Protestant. I'm not bashing Protestantism or sola scriptura, but the printing press makes that a different experience. And I would say would be maybe a contributing factor to the just plethora of denominations that explode after the Reformation. So, so that's, I know I'm going fast and bouncing all over the place when it comes to the development of sort of reading technologies. I guess I just fast forward then to digital reading. Unless you want to stop and talk a little bit about anything that I flew through there that you want to drill down on or clarify.
No, let's go to the digital, because I mean, there's so much to go through.
Sure.
And I think there's this, I think what I will mark though is I feel this temptation in myself in the digital space to be like, I wish we could just get rid of it. I wish we could go back to the 80s when I grew up, where the phone had a coil and you could only go so far around the house as the coil let you go. And, maybe you got tangled up in it, and so then you could go half as far. Like, that's the world that feels idyllic to me. And what I found so helpful, and the reason why I really wanted you to give us the full picture, is we lost, there was a trade-off at each turn of the road.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Right. And so I love how you throughout everything I've read of the book, I haven't read the whole thing yet. I cannot wait. It's been so great. But at every turn, there's been this sense of perspective that I think has been really healing as a parent, to recognize there have been, throughout history, there have been trade-offs.
Absolutely.
And there will be more to come. And I think digging into the digital conversation as far as the Scriptures are concerned is really important. But I did just want to mark that, like, what you've described is a half a dozen trade-offs just among these big milestones.
Yeah. And I mean, people were thinking about those trade-offs then too, right? Even Plato, the great philosopher of ancient Greece, he was worried about writing. He thought that the ability to write and basically distribute information on paper or papyrus, right, that would lead to a loss of human memory.
Which it did.
Oh, absolutely.
Because
sure. Yeah.
The Odyssey was an oral text, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
I try to fathom Homer and the other great singers, having literally hundreds of pages in their
Absolutely.
mind. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So, I mean, and then, Thoreau in the 1800s, one of the great philosophers of technology in the American tradition, he was around during the Industrial Revolution when things like the telegraph were emerging, and he thought the telegraph would weaken local community because we'd become more interested about national and international news than our own backyard, right? And
Yeah.
any era where new technologies emerge, exactly, there's people that are questioning the trade-offs. And really, we try to frame the whole book around that idea of trade-offs. I think it's a common misconception people have that technology equals progress. It's much more accurate to say technology equals trade-offs.
Mm.
And we've just sort of modeled that with writing technologies, right? And you can do that with any technology, everything from a shovel to a steam engine, to a bulldozer, to obviously digital technologies, which is the point of the book. So we're tapping into a long tradition of what we call the philosophy of technology, thinking about how these things impact us. The problem today, I would say in general, is we don't take that time to think about it. We just think we should use it because we can, right?
Yeah.
Or because this is new, it must be better.
Mhm.
We need to challenge that assumption very hard.
Mhm.
And the history and the tradition of this sort of philosophy of technology can help us see how to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we talk about digital reading, um, I mean, it's obvious just to say it's a very different experience. Okay. The brain interacts with physical text differently than digital texts because one is basically pixels on a screen that are constantly shifting, and the other is something that's actually physical and permanent. Okay, that's probably the most basic difference. Your brain, when it's reading a physical text, is sort of building a mental map or sort of a topography of the text, if you will. When you're reading digitally, there's nothing that your brain can anchor in the same way because it's constantly shifting and moving, right? When you scroll, when you use your mouse, when you use your finger, those pixels are moving, right? So it's not the same. Your brain isn't experiencing it in the same way. And Nicholas Carr has done a lot of this research as well in his book called The Shallows, which we tapped into in our book. So that's part of it. But there's another thing that I think people don't realize when they're reading screen digitally, and that is you're constantly being forced to make decisions about what to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is another thing that's well documented in the research. The parts of your brain that are activated are different if you're reading a physical book versus something on a screen. I mean, it's just fascinating. And what it is, it's the part of your brain that's sort of activated in what we might call survival mode. Okay, because when
Mm.
you're reading online, like I said, you're constantly being forced to make decisions. Do I click on this link? Do I keep scrolling? Do I, go to a different tab? Right? It's interactive in a way that's different than a physical book. You're able to rest and relax in reading a physical book in a way that you're not online. And I think we all just know this, right?
Yep.
If we've done both types of reading. There's also studies about what your eyes do when you're reading online. And it turns out when you're reading online, you don't really read sort of linearly. You actually read in what they call the F pattern. You might sort of scan the top, but then you'll scroll down a little bit, and then you'll scan a little bit less until you get to the bottom, and you're just scrolling the whole thing. That's the bottom
Yeah.
of the F, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, there's just all these things about the way we interact with digital text that is different. And that, constant feeling of having to choose or make a decision has huge costs when it comes to anxiety and fatigue, retention, attention span, all those types of things.
Mhm.
Um, and it makes us think that the purpose of reading is utilitarian,
Yes.
that we need to operationalize or instrumentalize the text for some ulterior purpose that I need to, produce or perform. And I think that's really subtle, but I think it's maybe one of the most important things to think about in the way we experience a text online versus in physical form.
Mm. So, as we're in this era of digital technologies, and I think about, I'm taking a walk and I'm listening to my Bible app because I'm not bringing the book with me, um, what and then bringing out our phones at church instead of bringing
Mm.
the Bible with us. What's the cost to that when we engage with the Bible in this way?
I think the costs are pretty large. One, I think it's training us in a very shallow experience and treatment of the scriptures. And I'm not saying there's no place for those types of apps or usage, but I think they have to be balanced with a more meditative posture towards the scriptures, where you're sort of in a much deeper way reading the text and experiencing the text. And a physical Bible can help with that. The physical Bible doesn't automatically make that happen, to be sure, right? We still get distracted, right? Our kids still cry, we still have random thoughts, right? Um, so it's not any magical thing when you read the physical Bible versus using a digital tool. But I do think we have to balance those digital means with a more meditative posture to the text. And some ways that might help with that. One would be there's a lot of Bible publishers that are producing what we call readers Bibles now, where basically they're getting rid of the verse and chapter numbers and also the headings to allow you to experience the text in a more sort of reader-friendly way, more like a novel, where you can sort of just get immersed in the text. I think that's helpful to try if this is something you're struggling with. And again, there's a place certainly for in-depth Bible study where you're using the concordance, where you're looking up this verse and that verse. There's a place for that, sure. And there's a place for the digital stuff too. But if it's always in that utilitarian mode where you're doing this for some ulterior purpose, right, to operationalize this, to instrumentalize that, to come up with 3 points or techniques for this or that, you're really falling prey to that, I would call the technological mindset, where everything becomes a technique or a procedure, where you've got to be productive, right? So there's got to be a balance when it comes to that more meditative posture. And I think
Mm,
church is a place where that should be modeled, honestly. Um, I, I I think that we really need to think more carefully about screens and phones in the actual church service. What are we modeling? What are we communicating by incorporating these very disembodied technologies into something that is based on the incarnation itself, right? Which is the embodiment of God. Um,
mm,
so that's a whole nother realm to think about as well when it comes to the life of the church, which I think should be a place where we're sort of grounded in the real, and sort of have an experience that's otherworldly, that's not being infiltrated by all of these other technologies that we're constantly absorbed in throughout the week.
The original intent was that we talk about like technological safeguards and healthy relationship to technology in the family, but the scriptures piece I thought was so powerful because I think that's something that is we aren't realizing its impact. And even just the reading that chapter that you put together shifted my engagement with the text just right there, where I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, I'm in some doing, right? I got to
Yeah,
learn, I got to grow, I got to understand and
yeah,
unpack.
yeah,
And sure, there's value in that, but am I
sure, for
being
sure.
with the Father? Like, to what
Hmm.
degree am I letting the text happen to me? Am I
Yeah,
reading it for its beauty, for the joy of the thing, for
yes.
the that moment where I'm like, oh, I remember what was going on in my life the last time I read this,
Mm,
those moments with the Lord, that
yeah.
intimacy. So good.
Yeah, yeah, and that also can then translate to other texts too, like when you're reading poems or when you're reading a book or a novel, right?
Yeah.
We frequently, I know this happens to me a lot because I write articles, right? So when I'm reading a book, I'm constantly thinking, okay, what quotes from this book can I use for my next article, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just taking in the book, right, and really
Yes.
reflecting on the book itself, we just that utilitarian mindset creeps in a lot for sure. Yeah.
So good. Well, and I love what you said going back to when you were introducing yourself and you were talking about woodworking. You were talking about the limitations of the wood, and that we
Hmm.
need to recognize our own limitations. And that there's something about, I think about some of the hardest seasons in my life, and I still do it on a hard day, where I would take my Bible to bed with me and literally just hold it over my heart. And you actually talked in the book about, or it might have been Robin that said this, how irreverent it would be to kiss the iPhone screen when we had the scriptures up, and and that
Yeah.
there's a sense of the holiness there. We can wrap our minds around like the holiness of the text itself can be imputed to the book, but we can't impute
Hmm.
it to the phone. And
Yeah.
so, I love what you said, grounding ourselves in the real. Take me there a little more. Like, how have you walked this out, through your woodworking, through your own just observation of students in the classroom? How can we come back to the real in this world where technology screams so loudly?
Sure, yeah. I think one way is for people to develop skills, hobbies, and crafts that require you to bump up against the limits of reality, right? Whether that's cooking, whether that's sewing, whether it's woodworking, metalworking, I mean, car repair, I mean, anything that forces you to skin your knee, right? Or rub your knuckles up against a bolt or whatever. I mean, something that gets you into your body in the environment around you, in a way that requires friction and risk, and I'm going to even say discomfort. Right, the human body is a very fascinating, complex organism that actually gets stronger when it encounters friction and risk and resistance. That's the word I'm looking for. It's an we're anti-fragile creatures. Nassim Taleb has a great book about this, where he talks about this concept of anti-fragility, that humans aren't fragile, they're not resilient, they're actually anti-fragile, right? Frequently, we treat our children as fragile beings, right? We need to protect them, right? And obviously, when they're infants, there's a great place for protecting them, right? But that protection, needs to sort of reduce over time so that our children actually can push to the limits, they can fail, they can face challenge. Because if we always treat them as fragile, we're actually not allowing them to develop in a way that's going to help them to flourish as adults, right? So human beings aren't fragile; they're actually anti-fragile, and resiliency is sort of in the middle. Like, something that's fragile, it breaks when you drop it, right? Like a china plate. Something that's resilient wouldn't break when you drop it, right? Like a plastic plate.
Yeah.
Something that's anti-fragile actually gets stronger when you drop it.
Oh,
Okay.
wow. Okay, now I've got it. This is amazing. Okay.
Those are the three things. And Talib argues we're in the anti-fragile category. We actually get stronger when we're dropped. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there's limits on that too. If you drop yourself from the Empire State Building, well, we know what's going to happen.
Please
But
don't
if
do that.
Right. But if you jump off a stool or, something that's 2 feet high, well, then maybe next time you'll say, hey, I can jump from a little bit higher, right? And your bones actually get stronger and your muscles get stronger and your hand-eye coordination gets better, right? So we need to bump up against the limits of reality, the limits of our mental abilities, our physical capacities. A great analogy for this is just good old-fashioned weightlifting, right? You don't get stronger by lifting the same weights all the time. You get stronger by adding weights to the bar, right? And that's what life is. And so you've got to uh, create habits and hobbies and patterns of living that are pushing you to the limits of reality. And like I said, there's great ways to do this in the home, right? Cooking is a fascinating way. That there's all sorts of limits with cooking, right? If you put too much salt in, it's not going to taste good, right? If you put the temperature too high in the oven, it's going to get burned, right? There's no escape the realities of the limits of any discipline, right? Whether it's a musical instrument, whether it's a hobby, right? So that's just one common sense way to do that. To stay connected with the real. I think that's really important. Let's see, where were we going? You had the question was ways to stay
Yeah.
connected to the real, I think, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. So hobbies are one way. I had some other ones in my head, but now I can't remember what they were.
Well, one thing that's
What do you want
amazing about this conversation, Josh, is actually the guest that is going to air like 2 episodes, one interview prior to you. Our conversation was all about creativity, and when I scheduled time with her and then with you, I was like, these are two such different conversations. And now as you're talking, I'm like, they're the same conversation. It's the same thing, engaging in the physical, that this idea, what you talked about, that we have to reckon with, what does it mean that we have staked our lives on a religion that is all about the enfleshment of God. And as far as I know, the only one, that actually claims, no, we aren't to go up higher to get to God. He came down as a baby.
Right. Yeah.
And so this invitation to engage in the physical world, to get out of the digital space, you know, and we'll talk more about kind of the how that you and Robin set forth, which I think was so powerful. It's actually essential for our faith.
I agree. I agree. And it's not because, digital technologies are bad. That's not
Yeah.
what we're arguing in the book, right? It's because there's something better.
Yeah.
And that I think is really important. Yeah, just to drill down a little bit more on this concept of the enfleshment of God and the implications of that. Just think about that. Yeah, like you said, Jesus comes as first off an embryo, right, in
Yeah.
Mary's womb, the weakest and most fragile of all creatures, and then as a baby, right, baby born into a poor family, a refugee family, um, and he's living at a time where he had to walk around uh, to like share his message, right? There was no radio, there was no printing press, there was no television, there was no video, there was no internet. Um, God had to slow down in the incarnation to walk around with human beings. And that is the paradigm. I mean, that's the pattern that Christianity puts forward of what it means to be a human. Christ is the true human, right? And his ministry was highly relational, highly bodily, if you will. Um, and that's the life that he brings us into, right? So that I think is something that there's just so much you could think about there when it comes to the incarnation and what that means for our humanity. But I do like to think about it technologically, like there was no video, no radio, right? If you're trying to think of an efficient way to get the message out, come
Yeah.
on, God, you could have came at
I
a
know.
different time, right?
Could have
But
come
no,
anytime.
no, exactly. If you will, God was being inefficient. Okay.
Yes.
Um, but that's the human experience. It's highly inefficient, right? Walking with somebody through depression or through a difficult time is highly inefficient. Relationships are highly inefficient, right? Changing dirty diapers is highly inefficient,
I know.
but
Mhm.
you know what? It's human.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
human.
Oh,
And
it's so
there's so
good.
much that we learn from that when it comes to love, when it comes to sacrifice. I
Mhm.
think that's the type of that's what forms us as people, right? Those experiences of suffering and strife and risk and resiliency and friction.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of my biggest concerns in the digital age is we are living in an environment where we don't have to experience that resistance and that friction, right? The screen is frictionless, right? Literally
Yeah.
with your finger, right?
Yes.
You're just
Yeah.
sliding, or even your eyes, right? You can control things with
Mhm.
your eyes now. It's training us to think that we have control over things that we're not meant to have control over, right? To be a human
Mhm.
being is to be a creature, to have limits. Even before the fall, Adam and Eve had limits. They were not God.
Yeah.
So that I think is something that's again maybe more subtle, but the formation that's occurring in the digital environment, I think, is training us to think we're autonomous beings that have
Mhm.
control in
Yeah.
a way that we don't, right? And it's
Mhm.
also training us to think that to to be a human being doesn't require a body, right? Because you can do so much in a disembodied fashion.
Mhm.
Um, and that again is counter to the claims of Christianity and the claims of reality, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think those are some other things to think about there. The type of people that are being formed in the digital environment over time, especially when we add AI into the mix, where we can outsource even more to the machine, if you will.
Mhm. Yeah.
What type of human beings are we forming? I would much rather form a human being that can play Bach on the piano, or maybe even become the next Bach, than somebody who can just push a button to play Bach.
Hey, Mama, let me ask you a question. When's the last time you gave yourself some white space? I am not talking about a trip to the bathroom alone or even the grocery store. When's the last time you had what I like to call some no one needs me time? For homeschooling entrepreneurs, time like this isn't a luxury. It's actually a key component to a healthy business, homeschool, and family life. So, if you're ready for your next respite, whether it's you by yourself, you and your spouse, or a family trip, join us at our peaceful haven, Just Like Paradise, located on gorgeous Oak Island, North Carolina. This 3-bedroom house is just a short walk to the ocean and nearby restaurants. It has a screened-in back porch with fireplace that is to die for, hot tub, and even a fire pit if you're feeling ambitious. Book through the link in the show notes, and then you have a unique discount code, podcast100, to get a $100 discount on your stay as a thank you for being one of my listeners. Get your next getaway on the calendar today.
Yeah. So take me here, because you said something, to that end of like that we're beginning to think of ourselves almost like creators, because we are masters of what we take in, and we're masters of the conversation that we have. And if we don't like where a conversation is heading, we just leave the Facebook group or leave the chat.
Sure. Yeah.
And I remember noticing this in my children when they were toddlers, and we were watching a sports clip on YouTube. My second born, may not surprise you, of course, wanted to watch football clips all the time from infancy, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a commercial, and he lost his mind, having to wait 10 seconds because the show was off. Where did the show go? And I remember watching him and going, oh, like, what do I do? Like, and when I was growing up, there's always a commercial, and that's when you went and got your snack, and that's when you went and talked to your mom, and that's, those are that was just inevitable, that 10 minutes of a 30-minute show were commercial breaks. And so I think it's interesting, because I feel like a lot of my listeners, and I certainly know this for myself, it's the technology feels like there's less of an attraction to it and more of like, I don't know how to live in my current community. I don't know how to do my work. I don't know how to stay in contact with the sports coaches and the tutors and the communities and the play dates and all that without this technology. And I see its impact, and it's so hard.
Yeah.
Like, even just in the past 10 years, I was reflecting, we had one of the big box TVs, and I don't think we even had cable. I think we had the rabbit ears when our oldest was little.
Yeah.
And so there were like the 3 interesting shows that she was allowed to watch. The TV was in a different room. And then, we didn't have any devices. There weren't any screens. But now our phones have, these streaming apps. And, it's like, we don't necessarily want it all. But then, we watch Survivor as a family, so we'll have Paramount Plus so we can watch Survivor. And Brian loves football, so we've got YouTube Plus because of football. But then it's like, but then there's I Love Lucy, and then there's Leave It to Beaver. And I'm like, these are okay things, but I feel like the proverbial like Dutchman with his finger in the dam, where I'm like, we need to watch less TV. Like, we need to, like, Cora got a tablet to do her schoolwork. And it's great because she can watch Jam with Latin on there, and she can work on her paper. But then I'm like, you're FaceTiming your friend. What's happening?
Yeah.
And
it's true. That's another thing with digital technologies. They just sort of bleed into everything else, right? Because they're not like prior technologies, which were primarily single-use tools, right? Digital technologies are multi-tools, omni-tools even, right? The computer can facilitate this conversation we're having right now. I can type on it, right? I can do PowerPoint presentations. I can surf the internet, right? It's an unending omni tool, and even more so the phone, right, which you're carrying around with you on your person or maybe even on your wrist, right?
Yeah.
So that's another thing that makes this even more difficult, is that we're not just dealing with a one-purpose tool. We're dealing with what I like to call a reality mediating mechanism. Like you said, you sort of have to like absorb yourself into it to do all these other things, whether it's communicate with your sports coaches or tutors or whatever it might be. And so that means, you have to think intentionally about these things. And this is something where everybody's going to be at a different place, right? Each family and each individual is going to have different, perspectives on this. And in the book, we certainly offer tips and suggestions, but we don't, offer any sort of legalistic, requirements or moralistic approach to it. We're just trying to come up, basically compile a lot of ideas that people have used and say, hey, you figure out something, right? Try
Yes.
something. Something's going to be better than nothing. Intentionality is so key. If you just sort of go with the flow, you're not going to be happy with the results. You're going to feel overwhelmed. You're going to be anxious. You're going to wish that, your family dynamics were different, right? So yeah, intentionality is a starting point for sure.
And then, and this is where I want to dig a little deeper, because you took several tips and you laid them out.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, and what I loved most, and I know I said this earlier, but I just want to underline this again. What I found so beautiful and really healing is, I know for myself, and I think a lot of us as parents especially carry this like low grade hum of shame around technology,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, I don't want it to look this way for my kids. I don't want it to look this way for myself. And like, when I'm tired, and and we even have an open dialogue in our home where we have a no hypocrisy rule. Like, that's one of the standard tenets in our families. Like, what I cannot require something of my children that I'm not already holding myself to.
Mm-hmm.
And my kids know that I'm limited. Like, Brian and I really try to own that openly with our children, so they have the right to check us. That said, that only extends so far, right? Because
Sure.
they know when mom's on her phone when she shouldn't be, they can get away with some things that they wouldn't be able to if I wasn't on my phone. So,
Yeah.
they're not mad about it all the time.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that does something to our family dynamic, and I
For
know
sure.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, tell us, like, take us into these tips. The first one you talked about was using time to compartmentalize. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure, sure. So what we mean by that is just the simple idea that you put boundaries on your schedule, right? I like to think about it as sanctifying time, right? So you set time limits, certain times of the day where you can be on your devices, certain times of the day when you can't, or maybe certain days of the week where you're going to take a break, right? A lot of people might take Sunday as a sort of a technology break. Um, so yeah, it's nothing earth-shattering here, right? We're just talking about being intentional about thinking through this ahead of time, right? And how you want your family life, how you want your individual life to be structured in a way that works with you and your job. And again, that's going to be different for everybody. But there should be some time each day where your phone is off and off your body. That's just, common sense. So that would be, the idea of sanctifying time. And in the book, Robin talks about, what's worked for his schedule. And again, that's going to be different for every person. A good rule of thumb that's in a lot of books on sort of technology practical tips is basically 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, 1 week a year, right? That's an easy way to remember it, and also think about the fact that, at some point during your day, you should be disconnected, right? At some point during the week, maybe there should be a longer period of disconnection, maybe in conjunction with the rest of your family, right? And then maybe one time a year, if possible, even a longer disconnection period where you can really spend family time together and replace that digital time with something better, again, to give you those grounding experiences in reality. And I think here, if I could just add another thing that just came to mind, that building of a reservoir of real life experience is very important because we're living now with people growing up, our own children, that are digital natives. This is the term for people that have sort of lived post-internet, right? Whereas me and you, we have some experience before the digital revolution, right? We have a reservoir of real life experience that maybe
Yes.
they don't have, you know.
Yeah.
And so you've got to accumulate that reservoir for your children of real life
Mm.
experiences so that they have some level of maybe inoculation, if you will, to the
Mm.
digital temptations. And again, that's not a surefire thing or anything, but there's got to be that reservoir that's built up. And again, adults that were digital immigrants, we have more of that, whereas those who are growing up in this environment don't. And so we've got to give it to them.
Yeah. Yeah, it has been interesting seeing some of the young adults that come into my life that will be even in more celebratory spaces, or, a time where that, I'll see them out on date nights and things like that, where they're both on their phones the whole time.
Yeah.
Or, seeing what dating is really just that they're texting and they're not really having
Yeah.
in-person conversations. I can't
Mhm.
conceive of this, but
Right.
this is the reality in which we live. And so it feels like there was a short period of time where there was this generation coming up where there was a brave new world where nobody really knew what would it look like for
Sure.
a generation to grow up on their phones, but
Yes.
now we can kind of see. And so
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah. The receipts are coming in and they're not
yeah,
good. Yeah.
they're not good, they're not
But
good.
you're right. It's been an experiment. We've been living in the experiment. We've been running it on ourselves and our children.
Yeah.
And there's enough receipts now where we can say, okay, we've got to think more carefully and intentionally about this. We've got to make countercultural decisions. And honestly, I'm hopeful in that regard. I think there's a lot of positive signs along the edges on this front. There's a great new book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, where he really compiles a lot of the data and offers some very practical tips. This book was sort of coming out at the same time Robin and I were working on ours. And in some ways, we extend some of his arguments. If you know anything about Haidt, he's basically he's an atheist.
Mm,
He's an evolutionary psychologist. And so he's coming from a very different perspective on these issues, but he's coming to a lot of conclusions that really resonate, I think, with a Christian perspective. So we sort of take some of those things further and apply them to areas that he doesn't. But yeah, there's hope along the edges, and I'd encourage families to participate in that, right? Make those decisions. It'll be worth it, even though it's hard.
I
So
want
yeah,
to.
we talked about sanctifying time. What else do you want to talk
Yeah.
about as far as tips?
Yeah. So, I mean, sanctifying space felt pretty straightforward. And you just had a
Sure.
short piece on that of just this idea of like the TV lives, not in the central spaces.
Right.
And so I loved that. Um, Talk to me about barriers to entry, creating barriers to entry.
Sure. Yeah. Again, this is a very simple trick or tip. It's one that's based in human psychology and sort of habit formation. But you want to make the digital activities harder to get to, if you will, right? You want to create a barrier to entry. So there'd be many ways to do this. A lot of people talk about with their phone, taking apps off their phone or taking Facebook or Instagram off their phone. So they have to actually go to the computer to use those things, right? That's a barrier to entry. Maybe you have somebody else know your password. You don't know it. So you have to actually ask them for your password to access a certain app or something like that. Maybe you bury all your apps like 3 screens down, not on your home screen.
Mhm.
So there's all types of little ways to do this. You can also do this with the internet or the computer at home, right? I would say the default setting for the TV and the computer should be that they're off, right? And you go to them when you have specific tasks that you're going to use them for. Um, so in our house, a few barriers to entry we have. Well, I'll give you one. We don't need to talk about my personal life, but one is
I always talk about
um,
mine. It's welcome.
yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the things we do in relation to the internet is we don't have a traditional internet service provider in our home. Basically, the computer is not connected to the internet. To connect the computer to the internet, I have to hotspot my phone and then, connect my computer to that hotspot. Now, that's an extremely small barrier if you think about
Yeah.
it, right? It takes two more steps that don't take a lot of time. But even that small barrier, prevents our some of our sort of listless use of the internet, right? Because you've got to intentionally go to it for a purpose. There
Mhm.
was a time where we didn't even have that at the house. We would go to the library for the internet. And so basically, we'd have to write a list down of things that we wanted to do when we went to the library to use the internet, right?
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of ways and levels you can think about this idea of barriers to entry. But that's really important on the negative side, right? To put barriers up in front of things that we want to limit or curate to a certain degree. Okay, so barriers to entry, if we're thinking about it, from the negative side, you want to put barriers up in front of things that you want to limit or curate, right? But then we also want to think about this from a positive perspective. And that's so key. It's something that we really try to harp on in the book, that this is not just about saying no to things. It's actually saying yes to better things. Okay. That is so vital. This is not a negative approach. This is not something where, this is about shame or guilt or anything like that. It's about offering something that's richer and more beautiful, that's more lasting and permanent, right? That can really provide a deeper, richer experience of life, right? That's really what this is about. So on the positive side, you want to lower the barriers to entry to the activities that you want to foster, right? And again, this is pretty simple. A lot of it has to do with where you put things in the house, right? And things like that. So for example, if you want to encourage your kids maybe to like play musical instruments, well then maybe like put them in the house in prominent spaces, maybe the in our homes in sort of America, it's the TV is the altar, right? But what if the TV wasn't the prominent thing? What if instead in the living area, there was a guitar in the corner, or if you have space, an upright piano, or board games and books were more prominently placed, right? Again, this is common sense stuff. There's no magic tricks. It's just about being intentional. What activities do you want to encourage, and how can you make those more easily accessible than the activities that you're trying to discourage? That's it.
Oh, I love that. And there was one more piece that you talked about kind of before we tie it all together, which is you talked about going another way, another path forward with this technology. This cultivating a healthier relationship with technology is going out and serving other people. That blew my mind. Can you talk about that?
This is really key as well. When you serve others, you're brought outside of yourself in a way that we really need. It's so essential to being a human being, to serve one another. And it forces you to encounter the limits of reality, the risks of relationship, sometimes the discomfort of serving someone, right? Sometimes it's awkward. Sometimes it's challenging, especially if somebody is sick, especially if somebody is disabled, right? You might be involved in intimately caring for them in a way that really forces you to swallow your pride. And again, that is modeled by Christ himself in his service to mankind. What does he say? He says he comes not to be served, but to serve, right? Again, he models this for us in the most profound of ways, where God himself comes to the planet as a person to serve the very people that are his enemies. That is beautiful. And I think this is profoundly powerful in a society that tries to outsource service to professionals or to organizations or to the government or to the school or whatever it might be, right? We tend to try to outsource those uncomfortable things to other organizations or groups, but to actually do that yourself in a certain way really grounds you in what it means to be a human. And on the same level of service, I would place hospitality, right? Making your home a place of hospitality and welcome. That's another thing we've sort of turned into an industry, right? The hospitality industry, hotels and restaurants and so forth. And those things are wonderful, don't get me wrong. But there's a place for the home as a place of hospitality. And again, Christ modeled this. He ate with sinners. He welcomes us to his table in the Lord's Supper. So our tables should overflow with that love that overflows from him, right? Same things in our churches, right? I like to think of there being sort of three tables. There's the table of the Lord, where he welcomes us into his family through faith in his son, Jesus Christ. And the table of the Lord would be the Lord's Supper, right? And then from that table, the love overflows to what I like to call the parish table, where the church eats together, cares for one another, serves and loves one another. And then that parish table overflows to our tables in our homes, right? Where that love then flows out into the community with our friends and neighbors and so forth. It's sort of like those wine towers, those wine glass towers, right?
Yes.
Where you got the bottle being poured at the top, then it just keeps overflowing. I love to think about that as like the triune love between the Father, Son, and Spirit that just is overflowing forever, right? And it's just overflowing into more and more wine glasses, and we get to participate in that. It's just such a wonderful thing.
Yes. There's a wonderful podcast episode. I forget what, Rachel Jankovic and someone. Anyway, they had a podcast episode that they called The Champagne Pour and talked about that exact
Okay.
idea.
Yeah.
This sense of what what he gives to us then pours through us, not from
Right.
this place of like a hole in the bottom of the bucket where we're just constantly
Yeah.
in deficit, which I think is so often, especially for a lot of my friends that are listening to this podcast, right? We kind of tend to just drain out because we're not
Yeah.
getting that pour in at the top. And I
Hmm.
love the way you described it, like it's at the Lord's table. And
Hmm.
then it's among the body of believers. And then from there, right? So we're poured into individually, and then we're poured into and pouring into corporately. And then
Yeah.
from there, when we fully received, when we're kind of like, what does it say in 1 Corinthians 13? Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Like I am fully
Mm.
known. And when I feel that sense of the Lord's grace and his favor over me, and that he rejoices over me with singing, when I'm sitting in that place of fullness, then it's just inevitable. Like I have that to give. And I love how you placed this call to serve in space of look at our neighbors, look at who is around us and what do they need. And so that was such an important invitation for me, I feel, of just what am I doing? What am I doing in this digital world where I'm, on social media and in my stories and live video and podcasting, and all that's wonderful.
Sure.
But there's something so different about walking across the street and knocking on the door, just saying, how are
Hmm.
you? How are you doing really? Do you need anything? Running to the store, is there anything I can get? It's just different. Oh, I
Yeah,
love
and
that.
that is so profoundly powerful in a society that like doesn't do that anymore, right?
Yes. Yes.
And in that way, I think the church really can be a place where um, we recover what it means to be human.
Yeah.
That's not the way we usually think about the role of the church, but I think in a very real way in the digital age, that's one of the things the church should be offering, a
Yes.
place to reclaim what it means to be a human being.
And yeah, I mean, how much better are we equipped than all others because our God was a human being, is a
That's
human
right.
being.
It
Yeah, that
is.
he
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
that
Yeah.
he was
Mhm.
enfleshed in space and time and lives on in physical body.
Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah.
so I want to leave us here, and I know I've underlined it a couple of times, but I just want to lean into again the invitation in your book that I think really for me was the greatest gift, which is this idea of it's not about. I'm actually going to read what you wrote. So this rule of life of this, and you talked about this idea of the Tech-Wise family, the book that was written by. Um, oh, I
Andy
don't.
Crouch.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andy Crouch. Um, you said this such a rule of life is not primarily about what we are against, but higher goods that we are for, specifically the permanent and lasting things. And then you read the foreword by teenager Amy Crouch, who's Andy's daughter. And she said, I think the best part of tech-wise parenting for me has been its focus on something older and better than the newest thing. The key word is better. Tech-wise parenting isn't simply intended to eliminate technology, but to put better things in its place. So you shared a little bit, make the books accessible, make the music accessible. But what would you say to the parent who's kind of just in that space that I find myself so often where I'm like, it just keeps happening. It just keeps infiltrating. It's so frustrating. Like I don't want this. I want conversations and I want connection and I want life around the table. Stop asking me when you can watch TV again. How how can and Josh knows my kids, so got a few wild ones. So what what else would you add to this idea of we're actually kind of supplanting the mediocre with the truly beautiful?
Yeah, it might be hard. It might seem mundane and ordinary, but it's worth it. So I'd encourage families to try something. Right? It could be very small. It could be something as simple as saying no devices at the dinner table. Right? Maybe that's a starting point for you and your family. So wherever you're at, there are small steps that you can take that will make an impact. It may be hard. It may take time. but it will be worth it. So I just encourage all your listeners to know that Christ is for them and with them through his life, death, and resurrection, and that we can rest in that finished work. And from that place of rest, then we have a sure anchor, and we're really free to serve our families and love our neighbors, right? And again, this isn't any legalistic burden or anything like that. It's because we know we're in Christ and we are secure in him. Then from that place of rest, Christ helps us make our homes places of rest and reflection and so forth. Yeah, so I'd encourage families to be willing to give some of these things a try and to talk together with one another. I'd also encourage families maybe to work together with one another outside of your own family. I think this is another thing where I'm encouraged right now. I see a lot of families coming together across the country to take various tech minimal pledges for them and their children. There's all sorts of groups that are emerging to do this. That's really encouraging. And I think that also helps us get past what we call a collective action problem, right? If I just make a decision about technology for me and my kids, I'm not going to see all the benefits of that if no one else does. And
Yes.
again, this gets messy, right? Because families are different. But families that willingly come together and say, hey, we're going to raise our kids in a certain way. These are some of the boundaries we're going to place. Let's do this together. Join me in this. Instead of, watching a movie, let's go have a picnic, right? Let's do some phone-free events or sleepovers. I mean, there's all sorts of ideas you can come up with, but don't try to go it alone, right? Start with you and your spouse and your children, and try to build a community of folks that can support you, because that's really going to be important.
Mm. Oh, I love that. And what I love about this and what I'm so grateful for in your book is it sparks ideas, right? Like even just reading the book, I was like, "Oh, I've got an old phone. I can put all the social media apps on the old phone and then leave the old phone in my workspace because that's when I need social media. I mean, not that I need it,
Yeah,
but that's when I use social media is for my
sure.
work. But then because it's on my phone, then I'm like, let's see what Instagram has to say because,
Oh, sure.
why
Yeah,
not? Right. And
right.
so it just spurs us on. And even I'm just even thinking of like, gosh, one, I don't have to, the plan, I can have a plan, but I can also just reach out to a friend and say, want to get together and leave our phones in the car, just
Yeah,
one time. And then
yeah,
once we have that, then what
right.
happens the next time? Someone
Yeah.
gets up to use the restroom and you're just sitting there at the table. It's amazing.
Yeah, I'm sort of encouraged with what I'm seeing with some young folks on this. I think some young people are checking out of digital living because they've seen what it's done to their parents, maybe.
Mhm.
Um, I was at a conference this summer talking about AI and education, which we have some stuff in the book about. And the room was full. There were over 100 people for the presentation. And at the beginning, I told them to hold up their phones. I wanted to see their phones, and then I wanted to tell them to turn them off. But there were some flip phones in the room,
Wow.
and guess who had the flip phones?
The younger people?
The younger people. Yeah, it was some of
Wow.
the people that were under 30, under 25, that were sort of new teachers.
Ah,
They've made a decision to get a flip phone. There's also some new phones that are on the market that are trying to reach this niche, if you will. There's a company called the Light Phone. Well, maybe that's not the name of the company, that's the name of the phone. But basically, it's a gray screen phone, grayscale phone. So that's another thing with all the colors, your eyes are
yes.
just drawn to it, right? So a
Yes.
grayscale takes some of that away. And it's a phone basically where you can call, you can text, and you can use maps and maybe like podcasts and some other things. But
Wow.
the idea there is, again, you're using it as a tool, right? When you want to
Yes.
make a call, when you want to do a text, when you need directions,
Yes.
to keep it in that tool use rather than this thing that bleeds into everything else. There's also a company called Tech-Less, which is offering phones that have limited uses and limit the number of apps and so forth. So those are some encouraging things as well, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, I love that. So for all of us that are listening that are trying to do this walk, it sounds like we're not alone and there's actually people forging ahead of us that we can follow after. Go, okay, I can give this a
yeah.
try. I won't be alone.
Yeah, if I could just do one more story, last week I got to share this.
Yes,
You
tell
like
me.
this because you know what CC is like. But so I teach the high school seniors. I have 10 seniors in my CC class this year,
It's a big
and
class.
yeah, it is. It's great. We have a lot of good conversations. It's a really good
Great.
group. But we were talking about technology and AI this last week. Almost every week, honestly, these topics come up. And they want to talk about it, which is great. But one of them was saying when he goes out with his friends to eat, they have this thing they do. It's sort of a pact. They put all their phones in a stack in the middle of the table during dinner, and the first one to pick up their phone has to pay for dinner. This is a high schooler, right?
That's
But what he's doing
amazing.
there, right? What he and his friends are doing is they're trying to live in real life, right? They're trying to recapture something together.
Yes.
By, again, it's not a big thing, but it's something that's important as these things accumulate, right? These little things accumulate into
Yeah.
something significant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I mean, it's so good. That's something Brian and I do on date night is we have one phone that the kids can, so the kids can communicate with us because they're
yeah,
old enough to watch themselves, such
yep,
as it is. While watching a movie. So there's a whole other, so we're technology free, but they are not.
right,
Um,
right,
but the other phone's in the car. And then,
yep,
when one person gets up, like like I said, we're just sitting there and it's the most, um, it's crazy how strange that now feels to just
hmm,
sit and be,
yeah, yeah,
but so precious. Like it's so important to have those moments.
yeah,
And I learned that from Simon Sinek was talking. I don't know if you know him. He's a thinker in kind of the space of career,
okay,
significance in your work and things like that. Um, and he talked about that probably a decade ago, that there was a no phones rule when his friends went out together. Maybe one
yeah,
person had a phone in case someone in the group needed to connect. So
hmm,
I love the invitation that you've presented, Josh, to just engage in this from a place of how can we pursue the good and beautiful. Like, this is not a place for shame. This is not a place to say you should or you ought to. This is a place to invite us back into the real, as you said.
hmm,
And
yeah,
it's just, and the way you tied it all together is, you know, Christ lives in the real for us. Like, that's where we find him. And so for us to shift out of this kind of ethereal, utilitarian, landscape in which we are so often finding ourselves, kind of, without thinking, without thought, that's where we land, right? And then to come back and go, okay, no, I'm present here and I'm with the
yeah.
Father. Oh, so good. So, okay, Josh, we're all going to get, are we all cyborgs now? Okay, we're going to read it. We're going to talk about it. And it is just such gift. Any final word of encouragement before we wrap up?
Yeah, again, I'd just say that you can do this. You can try something. You can do something that will make an impact. And again, it's not from a place of must, but a place of privilege and a place of opportunity. That there's something better for us and our families that can help us experience the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? And be a part of the permanent things, and be a part of these little platoons, as Edmund Burke called them, right? These pockets of humanity that are I think the hope of the future. Right? You can do it. Christ is with you. He is for you, and that's what we need. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Josh. And we'll have all your information in the show notes, but any place in particular that you want to send people so they can connect with
The
you?
book is available on Amazon. You could search for the title. I do a lot of writing for other publications that relate to, like I said, Christianity and culture, education, society, all those types of things. My writing portfolio is at muckrack.com / Josh Pauling, or you can just Google my name and find a lot of the things I've written. But I guess if you'd want to follow me, you'd have to like find me in person and get in line. And right now there's no line, so.
We're all lining up. I'm there for all of it. I am.
Oh yeah.
Josh, thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you. This is a privilege. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for engaging with the book and with the work. I pray it's a blessing. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All right. And to you who have listened, thank you for being here. Please get this book. It's such a gift. And let me know when you've got it so we can talk about it together. Until next time, you've got this because he's got you.
Friend, thank you so much for listening to this most recent episode of Overwhelmed to Overcomer. So listen, the whole idea behind this mission is that when we endeavor to be brave with our lives, we need to do it together. Belonging is key. So if you resonated with the message from this episode, share it with a friend. Do it together. Thank you again. And until next time, never forget, you've got this because he's got you.